Good morning. My name is David Loy. I'm the Dean of Christ College, and it is my pleasure today to welcome you to the 20th Annual Trembath Lecture. Good morning. This is off script, but I believe the first Trembath chair holder is in the room. Am I correct? So the first Trembath chair holder from a few years ago is in the room, Reverend Dr. Steve Mueller, who inaugurated this, and it has gone well ever since. The Trembaths, Harry and Carolyn Trembath, established this rotating theological professorship in 2002 as part of their estate plan. Committed Lutheran Christians, they wanted to support advanced theological research that was both faithful to Lutheran theology, but also done for the sake of the church. One way they sought to encourage this was to stipulate that the Trembath professor give a public lecture each year, typically in the year after the professor has held the chair. Most endowed professorships are assigned to a particular faculty member who permanently holds the chair. The Trembath chair, Concordia's first endowed professorship, was set up to rotate among senior theological faculty who have a strong research proposal. That decision has made the Trembath chair a very productive chair. Past holders have published numerous books and articles supported in part by the Trembath professorship. Concordia University's Christ College expresses our gratitude to the Harry and Carolyn Trembath Endowment for supporting this ongoing work. Before introducing today's speaker, I would like to acknowledge this year's Trembath chair holder, the Reverend Dr. Michael Eschelbach, here in the back. Dr. Eschelbach, may the Lord bless the church and your students through the research you have done this year. This morning's speaker is the Reverend Dr. Glenn Fluegge. Dr. Fluegge is a graduate of Concordia College in Seward, Nebraska, and Concordia Seminary St. Louis, where he earned his Master of Divinity degree. He holds a master's degree from Capella University and a PhD in theology from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He served as a missionary and theological educator in Togo and South Africa from 1998 until 2012. In 2012, he accepted the call to come to Concordia University as a professor of theology and as director of the Cross-Cultural Ministry Center, a position he's held since then. He has spoken and published widely on missions, theological education, and the post-Reformation theologian Johann Gerhardt. Dr. Fluegge's Trembath research focused on the link between God's mission to redeem the world in Christ and our mission as Christians. Moving far beyond the Great Commission of Matthew chapter 28, he developed a more nuanced and more joyful view of our mission. Today's lecture is entitled Mission Bridge Metaphors Toward a More Joyful and Hopeful Approach to Mission. Please welcome the Reverend Dr. Glenn Fluegge.
Good morning. Thank you, first of all, for coming out and being a part of this. And thank you also to the Trembath family for giving myself and lots of other theologians over the years the opportunity to take some time off and delve in and dig deeply into a topic. During my time last year, I kind of had three projects that I was working on. The first project was exploring what it means to call theology a habitus, and that kind of stemmed from my dissertation work. I'm not going to bore you with that, so I'm not going to present on that, but I did produce an article on that. And then I also prepared for publication missionary journals that I had written while on the mission field, so that's an ongoing project. But what I want to focus on today is kind of my work on developing a theology of mission. There are a lot of different theologies of mission out there, and a lot of them are competing with one another, if you think about it. And so I thought, well, is there any way that I could kind of participate in that conversation? And more to the point, that the Lutheran Church and our Lutheran approach to missions and theology could also participate in that conversation. And so what I'm going to present is part of that, but I want to zoom in on what I call mission bridge metaphors, and I'll explain more what that means a little bit later. Now, before I continue, I want to say that I'm not presenting finished work, This is still in process. And so this presentation is also an invitation for all of you to join the conversation. I really have some serious questions, and I need your help to kind of define mission bridge metaphors, identify others, and I'll have a series of questions for you, and I expect you to help me now. Okay, so thank you for that. Let me start with a little bit of background so that you know my starting point on this, okay? So I'm concerned with not just the actions that we do, but I'm concerned with the motivation of our actions. I think that's important for us as Christians. It's not just the activities that we do, but that we do those activities with the proper motivation, right? It seems like when it comes to mission, there are two extremes. One extreme is that there's kind of a lack of mission activity. So for instance, I know a Barna survey just came out recently where about over 50% of millennials, especially young millennials, are reluctant to share their faith. And some would say that it's even wrong to do so, right? And so there's this feeling out there, especially because we live and breathe in a context of an unchurched society now, at least increasingly unchurched, depending on where you live in the United States, that there's this tendency toward kind of mission indifference or neglect. Sometimes on my snarky days, I'll call that mission laziness, right? Okay. In reaction to that, or in response to that, on the other side, you have what is often this law-motivated mission. And on my snarky days, I call it mission force labor, okay, which leads to a kind of mission guilt. Now, much of this comes out of William Carey and his publication of a book called An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. That was published in the 1700s. And since then, that's kind of dominated the way that we think about missions. It's law-oriented. It's obedience to a command, right? And I'm not sure that's as helpful either. And so I think both extremes are unhelpful and probably unbiblical as well. And so what I'm looking for is a gospel-motivated mission that leads to a salvific mindset, so a mindset that is concerned with the salvation of the world and the salvation of all of those around us, including our neighbors, our friends, our families, and so on and so forth, that finds expression and kind of flushes itself out in the everyday vocations in which we live, okay? And one way to do that is by emphasizing God's mission. In other words, emphasizing how God continues to be about restoring and redeeming the world. And then our missionary activities are simply a part of that. So we participate in what God is already doing. I had one student kind of illustrate it like this. He said that God's mission is kind of like the East Australian current in the movie Finding Nemo, if you remember. My kids are a little bit older, but when they came out, they weren't, so we watched this numerous times. We participate and are propelled forward and carried along by God's mission like Crush and Nemo were carried along by the East Australian current, right? It's not so much about having to do certain activities as it is about just being carried along what God is already doing throughout the world to redeem and to save the world. Chris Wright, probably the most influential missiologist, I would say, in the last 100 years, he wrote a book called The Mission of God, by the way. There's a reading group, a couple of us who are actually reading through this. If you want to join that, please get in contact with me. But this is how Chris Wright defines mission. Fundamentally, our mission, if it is biblically informed and validated, means our committed participation as God's people at God's invitation and command in God's own mission within the history of God's world for the redemption of God's creation. Our mission flows from and participates in the mission of God. Now notice something here that he really emphasizes that this is God's mission. So we see that several times in this definition. And our role in this is participating in his primary activity. So our activity is derivative. It flows from what God is primarily and principally doing. Here's one way to illustrate this. This is illustrating, it's a diagram that illustrates the Christ-centered mission story of Scripture. Notice that at the very center, that's the Christ event. Then you have, let's see, to your left side, you have the Old Testament. To your right side, you have the New Testament, including the church, which would include our participation in the mission. And when I say our, my participation in the mission. I'm going to go through this real quick because I want to give you a sense of the mission of God that we participate in. Now, just keep in mind that this is a real quick overview, and we could spend an hour on each one of these verses, and I will in my mission class, but we're just going to go through this real quick. So in the beginning, you have Adam and Eve in the garden, right? And Adam and Eve fall into sin. Now, what I find amazing about this account of the fall into sin, but also what happens afterwards, is that God doesn't just start over. Have you ever thought about that? God doesn't just say, okay, that didn't work, let's create something else. Rather, he restores Adam and Eve, he seeks them out. That's the heart of a missionary God, seeking them out, and then giving them this promise that there will come a Savior who will crush Satan's head, and that gives them hope. And in having that hope, Adam and Eve are restored to God. That's the first restoration. But here's what we never think about. That's surprising enough. But there's a double restoration. There's a second restoration that happens in this same account. God decides in his wisdom. Now, for me, it seems to be folly, stupidity. I would never do this. I even find it hard to do with my own kids. Okay? When they mess up, I don't give them a second chance sometimes. Or at least I don't want to. Okay. I know as a good parent I should, but there's really something tugging on me saying, well, maybe you don't trust them. Maybe you shouldn't you shouldn't give them a second chance. Okay. But that's not what God does. God actually not only restores Adam and Eve to himself through this promise of a Savior, but secondly, he also promises to use Adam and Eve as the very means through which he will save the world. And I find that bizarre because he could have easily have used angels. He could have used something else he created. He could have used all sorts of things. But he primarily chooses Adam and Eve to be the means through which he will carry out his mission. And I think that's astounding. I think that's something that we often miss. That's the double restoration. Now, we could dig into these first 11 chapters of Genesis, but let's jump to Genesis chapter 12. And here we see that God calls a particular family, that is Abraham, to carry out his universal mission. Now, this is important to kind of distinguish here, just so we don't misunderstand this. God's purpose here is not to just save Abraham. Okay? His mission remains universal. So the scope of his mission is universal, but he's choosing one particular family through whom he will carry out his mission and through whom he will bless all peoples on earth. And then that promise to Abraham is reiterated in Exodus 19 when he affirms his covenant with Abraham's descendants, and that's a Sinaitic covenant. And so, again, he's choosing a particular people, the people of Israel, to carry out his universal mission. So the scope remains universal. Now, this particular passage, let me read it, because I think it's important. You will be for me, and this is Yahweh talking to Israel, you will be for me a treasured possession among all peoples, for indeed to me belongs the whole earth. But you will be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. Now, I think some people understand this passage in an adversative way. And there are some translations who also translate this in an adversative way. In other words, they translate it something like this. Although the whole earth belongs to me, I choose you, Israel. And it kind of pits Israel against the nations. And I don't think that's the gist of what Yahweh is getting at here. Rather, I think it's more purposeful. So it's something like this. I am setting you apart, Yahweh says to Israel, with a purpose. I'm setting you apart as a holy nation. So I make you holy, and I set you apart with a purpose. And your purpose is to serve as my priest to the world. Now, a priest was essentially a representative of the world to God and a representative of God to the world. So a priest was a mediator between God and the world. So Israel's purpose is that of a priestly purpose, which is, in some respects, is a missional purpose, if I can use that word. Now, we could spend a long time fleshing that out on all the different passages throughout the Old Testament, exploring how Israel's missionary role is fleshed out through Israel's history. And we would find that as we do that, Israel tends to fall into two extremes. They fall into isolationism on the one hand and syncretism on the other. So isolationism, they actually begin to believe that God's purpose in electing them finds its fulfillment in them alone, rather than in the world. And so they begin to isolate themselves from the world so that they can keep what has been given them to themselves. On the other hand, they fall into syncretism, which is essentially adopting the practices and gods of the nations around them. And both of those extremes that they tend to bounce back and forth between and fall into, both of those extremes hinder them, and in some ways you could say almost disqualifies them from carrying out their missional role. Yahweh says, or Isaiah says, or records Yahweh saying, "It's too small a thing for you to be my servant to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel. I will also make you a light to the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth." Now, of course, this is a servant song, and Yahweh is talking about Israel, but we know that it's bigger than Israel. You see, Israel was always waiting for the true servant to come, and that leads us to the Christ event there in the center. Jesus is what I call the ultimate embodiment, fulfillment, and agent of God's mission. And what do I mean by that? Well, he's the ultimate embodiment in that he's the personification of Israel. He's Israel reduced to one. He's Israel who doesn't fall into the extremes of isolation and syncretism. He's Israel who actually carries out God's mission and becomes the ultimate missionary. He's also the fulfillment of God's mission. Through his life, death, and resurrection, he fulfills God's mission. And he's also the agent of God's mission in that he's the ultimate missionary. If you think about it, John loves this motif of send, okay? For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Just as the Father sent me, he says in John 20, 21, just as the Father sent me, I am sending you. So John loves this theme of send. Send in Greek is apostello, from which we have apostle, and translated into Latin, we have missio, we have missionary. So you could, like linguistically, etymologically, say that Jesus is the ultimate missionary because he's the sent one. And we see this all throughout Jesus' ministry. We see that he's crossing boundaries and he's reaching the lost. Jesus is the ultimate missionary. But he's also the agent, he's the agent of God's mission, not just during his ministry, but he continues to be the agent of God's mission even throughout the book of Acts. And this amazes me. And I find it very encouraging too, to know that Jesus is continuing to carry out his mission. So for instance, in the first verse of Acts, Luke says this, "In my former book," that is the gospel, "I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach." And here we get the strong implication that Jesus began to do it during his lifely ministry, but now he's continuing to do it in the book of Acts. But what's strange about that is that besides the first chapter of Acts, we don't really see Jesus doing anything, and yet he's obviously still doing things. He's still carrying out God's mission through the church. You can also look at Acts chapter 26, 23. This is Paul defending himself against King Agrippa. And listen to what he says here. He says, I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. And this is what they said, that the Messiah would suffer and at first rise from the dead. Okay, no big deal. We know that. That's a messianic interpretation of the Old Testament. The Messiah is the one who suffered and died. The Messiah is the one who rose from the dead. But then Paul goes on and says, and the Messiah would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. Well, what's the subject of that verb, to bring the message of light? It's not the apostles, it's not the church, it's not any individual, it's not any Christian, it's the Messiah. So Jesus continues his mission throughout the New Testament and also throughout the church. So this is kind of what we have here so far. God, in the person of Jesus Christ, carries out his mission to restore and redeem the world. Now, let's personalize that a little bit because I think it's important to do that, and I think that's what the biblical text wants us to do. So we could say, God, in the person of Jesus Christ, carries out his mission to restore and to redeem me and you. Okay? Then you have the apostles and his church, and by extension, you and me, carrying out our missionary activities. Okay, what's missing? What's missing is this link. It's the bridge between God's mission and our mission. And I've found that bridge is very, very important because it connects our mission activities to God's mission. Now, there's a very practical question that comes up here, and I've encountered it my entire career. And the question is this: how do we talk about our missionary activities? Now, I encountered this question in a lot of different venues. We were missionaries for almost 15 years, and during that time, we would often come back to the United States, and I had to give presentations on the work that we were doing, report back to the churches. I had to preach mission sermons. And as I was doing that, I encountered this question: how do I talk about our missionary activities on the field? And then when I came back here to the States at CUI, I started teaching, and I started engaging in discussion with students about how to talk about mission. And so the question came up again, and we kind of narrowed in and even dug deeper into it. And here's what I discovered. I discovered that every conscientious Christian who spent any time in the Bible, we kind of intuitively know that our mission activities are derivative. They're secondary, right? They come from something beyond ourselves. They come from God. And so they flow from God's primary activity. Hence, for instance, when a leader of a short-term mission gets up in front of church and speaks, they'll often make this connection. They'll say something like this: God has called us to support our brothers and sisters in Kenya. Or maybe something like this: Jesus directs and commands us to make disciples, and we'll have opportunity to do that during our mission trip in Haiti. Or something like this: God is sending us to New Orleans to help with recovery efforts after Hurricane Katrina. Or maybe something like this: in a world that finds itself immersed in darkness, we have the opportunity to be lights reflecting Christ into our surrounding neighborhood. Okay. And there's a lot of different ways that people talk about mission. Now, we make these comments, and sometimes we make them without giving them much thought, but as I began to work on these presentations for my furlough and mission sermons, and especially as I engaged in conversations with students about this, I began to realize that very often in making this bridge, we use certain images. And these images are really important because they communicate something about our missionary God, and they communicate something about how we view our own mission activities. Now, I've come to call these mission activities mission bridge metaphors. In other words, we often bridge between God's mission and to our mission activities by using what I call mission bridge metaphors. In short, I call them MBMs. Okay? Now, that begs the question, why metaphors? And, are we sure these are metaphors? And to be honest with you, I've bounced back and forth on this, okay? I was convinced they were metaphors, and I was convinced maybe they were images and motifs, and we couldn't call them metaphors. But I think I've finally come to the conclusion that these are indeed metaphors. And I'll put two reasons up in front of you, and we can continue to engage in discussing this. Please, look me up and we'll talk about it. I've been influenced by, first of all, Jack Preuss's book, which he published in 2000. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. A very, very helpful book, very insightful, I think, called Just Words. And essentially, it identifies and categorizes the various metaphorical ways the Bible talks about the gospel, the doctrine of justification, if you will, that we're saved by faith, by grace through faith. So the question was, could the same be done when it comes to ways of talking about mission? So that intrigued me with the idea of metaphors. But even more so, and more kind of on a fundamental level, I've been convinced that these are indeed metaphors because of George Lakoff's contemporary theory of metaphor. And for this, I got to give a shout out to Dan Dean, who turned me on to George Lakoff and his research on metaphors. Mind-blowing stuff, and I just think it's very insightful. Let me just read this, and then I'll try to explain it. The word metaphor was defined in the past as a novel or poetic linguistic expression where one or more words for a concept are used outside of its normal conventional meaning to express a similar concept. I think most people understand metaphor kind of in that light. In other words, it's just a matter of linguistic expression. This classical theory turns out to be false. The word metaphor has come to mean a cross-domain mapping in the conceptual system. In short, the locus of metaphor is not in language at all, but in the way we conceptualize one mental domain in terms of another. And then he goes on, everyday abstract concepts like time, states, change, causation, and purpose, and then I added, and means, because that's particularly important for our discussion, and he also talks about that in his article in his book. These sorts of abstract concepts also turn out to be metaphorical. The result is that metaphor is absolutely central to ordinary natural language semantics. What's he trying to get at here? And we could dig into this a lot, but let me just say this. According to Lakoff, metaphor is not just a matter of linguistic expression. Metaphor operates at the level of conceptualization. It's not that we conceptualize something and then we choose to express it using metaphorical expression. Rather, Lakoff argues, and he shows quite convincingly, that metaphor shapes the way that we conceptualize abstract ideas. So for example, we conceptualize time metaphorically such that we say time passes. It's not like we have some sort of concept of time in our heads, and then when we go to speak or write, we use a metaphor. No. We actually conceptualize time as movement on a plane. Okay, so metaphor goes all the way down to the level of concept. Okay, the point is this, so we don't get lost in the weeds, and we can do that with Lakoff. The point is this. We use metaphor in every aspect of our language much more than we think. And noticing the metaphors is important because it reveals something about how we think about certain things. And that's exactly what I want to do. So here's an attempt. And you know how you can be working on something for quite a while and then realize you don't have a definition for it? That's kind of where I ended up in this presentation. And so I had to come up with a definition. So this is kind of one of those attempts at a definition, and we'll see if it works and how we need to amend it. MBMs are metaphorical expressions illustrating and describing God's continued present work of redeeming the world through the activities of believers. That last part's important. After and because of his life, death, and resurrection on its behalf. They describe God's present-day application of salvation to the world such that they specifically provide insight into how our activities are connected to the activity of God. Let's do this. Let's talk about 4 or 5 parameters that I've established when it comes to identifying MBMs. Because when I started looking at the Bible, holy cow, everything was a metaphor. Everything seemed to qualify. So I had to kind of set up parameters and say, no, we're not going to use that. We can't use that. That's really not what I'm trying to get at here. So here's some parameters that I established. First of all, a mission bridge metaphor uses metaphorical language. And there's also a lot of literal language in the Bible as well. That would include any sort of concrete physical experience. So something like the Apostle Peter exited the house. Okay, that's not metaphorical. Okay, that would be literal. But the vast majority of the ways the Bible describes the connection between God's mission and our mission, those are metaphors. It's metaphorical expression. And it involves, and the reason it's metaphorical expression is because it involves concepts such as cause, such as purpose, and such as means. And those are often expressed in our minds as metaphors. Secondly, an MBM is clearly and expressly linked to a biblical text. And so it's not just any image that we might think of or create in a presentation, a sermon, or as we're talking about it, right? But I wanted to limit it to the Bible itself. I'm not saying those images that we create aren't wrong, okay? You could say, God's mission is like an airplane, and we're on an air, obviously that's not biblical language, right? That's coming from the contemporary scene. And I'm not saying that's wrong, I'm just saying I wanted to limit my research to Scripture. Thirdly, an MBM expresses the application of salvation to the world. So it's not describing salvation for the world. It's not describing Jesus Christ's life, death, and resurrection and what and how the world is justified through that. Rather, it's expressing the application of salvation to the world. Fourthly, it focuses its actions on those outside the people of God in hopes that they might become part of God's people. This was a bit tough because there's a lot of metaphors that just talk generally about sanctification and Christians carrying out good works. But I was particularly interested in those metaphors that focus specifically on those outside with the goal of and the hope that they would one day become part of the people of God. So that's why it's a mission metaphor and not just a sanctification metaphor. And then finally, it directly or intuitively gives insight about the connection between God's mission and our mission activities. So some mission metaphors, at least as far as I can tell from the text, they can be metaphors for mission activity, but they don't give much insight into the connection between God's mission and our mission. And so I've tried to focus on those metaphors that really help us understand that connection. And most of them do. I'm not exactly sure why, but I think most of them do because the biblical authors were very, very concerned with that. And so they use metaphors where that connection is illustrated. Let me give you a couple examples here. Now, as I do this, I'm not going to go into all these examples. I'm not going to go into all of them in detail for two reasons. One, we don't have time, and secondly, I haven't finished the research. I still got to dig deeper into some of these metaphors. But here's a few examples. First of all, you have sent or apostle. Jesus uses this in John 20:21, the verse I mentioned earlier. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Okay? And from that, from the word send, apostello, we have the noun, the derivative noun, apostle, apostolos. And then from that, we have missionary, the word missionary, as I mentioned earlier. And so Paul uses this also in 1st, 2nd Timothy. He also uses this in a lot of other passages where he calls himself an apostle. An apostle is someone, often the representative of the king, officially commissioned to a position or task, sent out on a special assignment. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Here's another one, discipler. Therefore, go and make disciples, baptizing and teaching. Well, a discipler is someone who makes disciples of others, and a disciple is one who binds himself to a teacher, a rabbi, or a master in order to acquire his practical and theoretical knowledge. Here's another one, herald. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without a preacher, without a herald? Okay, derived from the verb kerusso in Greek. And Paul calls himself, the wrong word is highlighted there, so you have to forgive me. This is the same verse that we used for apostles, 2 Timothy 1:11. Paul calls himself a herald, okay, a kerux. So what's a herald? A public official formally appointed and vested with authority as an official representative of the king who conveyed the king's official messages. Now what's interesting here, and I don't know if Dr. Middendorf is here, but he's the one who, there he is, yeah. So Dr. Middendorf has convinced me, and I think he's written quite a few articles. It's in his commentary, but he's made the argument that preach, proclaim, kerusso, as well as evangelize, these are verbs that are primarily directed at those outside of the church. Verbs used for those inside of the church are prophesy and teach. And so I hope I got that right, Mike. But that's, and so here, this is a mission bridge metaphor. We may think of preaching normally in terms of our congregations, but actually Paul uses this verb expressly to talk about communication to those outside of the church. Here's another one, priest. You're a chosen people, a royal priesthood. Okay, obviously Peter is, he's imitating Moses in Exodus 19, what Yahweh said there. And then also Revelation talks about the people of God as priests as well. So a priest, as I mentioned earlier, is a mediator who receives God's forgiveness and gives it to others. So represents God to the people and the people to God. Okay? And here's another one, a witness. This will be the last one we'll kind of go over. Jesus in Luke 24, so after he's risen from the dead, he sends out his apostles as witnesses. And then in Acts 1:8, sure enough, they go out as witnesses. So these are just a few examples of MBMs, and I'm still digging deeper into each of them to discover their individual nuances. Here's a list of the MBMs that I've identified so far in the scriptures. Just real quickly, let me read through them. Sent one, discipler, herald, evangelist, witness, ambassador, servant, minister or attendant, which is different than servant. They're using two different Greek words there. Steward, worker, called, instrument, or kind of called one, right? Instrument, vessel, light, co-heir. I'm intrigued by that one. I don't want to get rid of it. It's not as clear as the others, but I don't want to get rid of it. I'd love to have a conversation with you guys about that one. Because I do think it might be a mission metaphor. Priest, libation, okay? Now, what's interesting about these different MBMs, or mission bridge metaphors, is that they can be categorized in different ways. And so I also wanted to try to do that because that might be more helpful. So one of the ways to categorize them might be by contextual theme. And Preuss does this in his book. He actually he categorizes the different metaphors of justification according to certain categories. So he has creation metaphors, commerce metaphors, deliverance metaphors, personal metaphors, sacrificial metaphors, and so on and so forth. Okay? So could we do something like that with these metaphors? And here's what I came up with. And again, this is just a preliminary list. But it seems like we might have royal metaphors, which would include like an ambassador sent out by a king. That seems to be the sense of this. A herald. Even an evangelist, which originally meant the announcing or the proclamation of victory, the king's victory, a great victory. That's what we see in Isaiah 52, verse 7. And also sent out, as an apostle from a king. Now, you can make an argument that, maybe sent would belong, sent one or apostle would be somewhere else, but you could also make an argument that it belongs there. Service metaphors: servant, minister, steward, worker, called one, and so on and so forth. Legal metaphors: witness and co-heir. Instrumental metaphors: I think those are very interesting. Instrument, vessel. I'm not sure where to put light, so it got placed there. And just that one trumped me several times. Worship metaphors: priest, libation, and pedagogical metaphors: disciple. What's interesting is that there's not a whole lot of pedagogical metaphors used as MBMs. And of course, Matthew does. Really, outside of Matthew, make disciples is only used, I think, once in one other place in the book of Acts. I wonder why, and I wonder why Matthew 28, which is so common, is more of a law-oriented approach to mission. Because it's more like follow Jesus' example. So that's worth exploring. MBMs can also be organized by referent. This might be very helpful. Again, these are very, very preliminary thoughts, but just keep this in mind. An enduring question and debate within Christianity, even to this day, is whether or not all Christians should be expected to participate in all ways in God's mission, or whether or not some are called to certain ways of participating that others are not called to. So I'm thinking particularly of the office of the holy ministry, and especially someone who might be called as a missionary. So are some MBMs used to express that specialized office versus general application? And this we mix up all the time in the church, right? Everyone's an apostle and everyone's an ambassador, right? And the biblical text doesn't seem to allow that. Now, I'm not saying that maybe by application we can't do that, but according to the biblical text, that's not really the case. So things like MBMs like ambassador, Paul's talking about himself and those who are also sent out on behalf of the church, sent out by the king, if you will. Not everyone is sent out as an ambassador like Paul was. Again, this is a very preliminary list, and I know it's hotly debated, right? So we could talk a lot about this, but this is even something like discipler, make disciples by baptizing. Well, is everyone called to go out and baptize? That's an interesting question, okay? And so maybe that's not for general application. But then you have instrument, vessel, servant, light, priest. Priest obviously is talking about the priesthood of all believers in 1 Peter 2:9. Okay. So there's a lot of conversation we could have about this, but I actually think that this last categorization that I want to put in front of you is perhaps the most helpful. I struggled with what to call this, but these are categorizing MBMs by primary emphasis of the bridge. So what we're focused on here is the actual bridge, asking the question, what main idea about that bridge are we emphasizing? And this is particularly helpful because it helps us recognize the baggage that comes along with the metaphor that we've chosen to use. So for instance, if we're talking about ambassador, the baggage, quote unquote, that comes along with that is authority of sender. It's talking about, hey, it's not all about you, it's about the one who sent you. Okay? Evangelist or herald talks about faithfulness of the message. It's not you just talking, but you're talking on behalf of the king. So don't talk at all unless you're going to say his words. That sort of thing. Instrumentality of means, instrument, vessel. I wasn't sure where to put called, so it ended up there. That's another one. Libation, where God uses someone to carry out his purposes. And that seems to be how Paul is using that as well. Or diligence of laborer. If you skip to co-heir, reception of gift, that's what I find that so intriguing, to talk about God's mission, not as an obligation, but as a gift that God gives us, that we inherit God's mission. We inherit the world, as Paul says in Romans chapter 4, verse 12. He calls Abraham, he says that Abraham inherited the world. What does that mean? Okay, so do we inherit the world? Not in some sort of take up the sword and conquer it, but literally, but also take up the sword, the word of God, and save the world through that. And so each one of these categories kind of helps us understand the baggage that comes along with the metaphor we're using. Why is this important? It's important because each MBM emphasizes certain aspects of our missionary God and his mission. We can gain a fuller understanding of God's mission by just knowing all of these different metaphors and not sticking to just one of them. I also find that some MBMs are emphasized by certain traditions more so than others for various reasons. So in the evangelical world, make disciples that's like the hands down common metaphor. The problem with make disciples is that it carries the baggage of obedience to a command. And so mission becomes a matter of obedience rather than gift. So it's just important to know that. And so I guess the question is our favorite MBM skewing our understanding of mission in a way that might be unhelpful? And then kind of along with that, some MBMs have inherent nuances, good or bad, that we may wish to either highlight or avoid. Okay? In a recent sermon, I think maybe some of you were there, I preached at an ordination and I used the MBM of Herald because I wanted to emphasize that Timothy Potoff, it's not your words that you're to speak, but rather it's God's words. And so I could use that metaphor and emphasize that. And then finally, the variety of MBMs helps us maintain a gospel M4M, or a gospel motivation for mission. So I know this is a time where you're supposed to ask me questions. I'm fine. I can answer questions that you may have, but I wanted to ask you questions and get your take on this in our time that we have left. Here's a couple questions that are whirling around in my head. Are there other MBMs that I'm missing? That's a big one. Are there ways to categorize them in more helpful groupings? Are there ways to describe the groupings that are more helpful and more understandable? Okay, especially the primary emphasis of the bridge. I don't know I struggled with what to call that. How helpful is it to know the original meaning of these MBMs versus their New Testament meaning? I mean, what are we targeting here? And then finally, am I misconstruing any of these MBMs for the exegetes in the room? For which MBMs do I need a more nuanced understanding? So those are my questions, but I can also entertain any questions you guys might have as well. Okay? But if you have any answers to these questions, please, let's talk.